television sets. Smaller Asian countries, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, were already kind of in the sights. You could see that they were rising as economies. Peterson told the president, look, we've got to, as a country, break free from the habits that we developed in this brief, glorious period. Or we think of it as the period when America was great, in the 1950s and 1960s, when we did everything better than everybody else, and start implementing a strategy for responding to this much more competitive global economy. I'll give you just a few examples of the sort of things he argued. So Peterson said, look, trade liberalization is good. Trade rules are good. We should encourage competitive advantage. We should encourage the location of production where it makes sense. He said, but if some countries are going to behave in a deliberately mercantilist fashion, they're going to try to gain export advantage. They're going to try to block U.S. imports. That is going to hurt the United States, and it's going to drive investments offshore. He called for a trade negotiation strategy that he said, look, we need to focus more narrowly on U.S. economic interests to try to discourage these kind of mercantilist practices. Indeed, it was almost a kind of we should have an America first trade negotiating strategy at a time when most of those in charge of the State Department and elsewhere really saw these trade agreements much more as foreign policy diplomatic tools than as economic tools. Peterson was writing long before anyone was thinking about China as an economic power, but he had a line in that paper that really captures the China problem perfectly. He said, look, there are countries out there that are offering a wide variety of subsidies to their producers and to their exports to help them compete in external markets. He said, quote, in moderation, this could be tolerated, but carried to an extreme, the international preoccupations of any developed world power can become externally provocative and ultimately self-destructive. That is not a bad quote for what happened with China in the 2000s. One place I could have used a slide. If you look at the steel industry, in 2000, the United States and China produced roughly the same amount of steel, just over 100 million metric tons. In the last 15 years, China's steel production has gone up tenfold. China now basically produces enough steel for the whole world, and the U.S. steel industry has shrunk slightly in that period. And a lot of that is because the Chinese government has plowed money into its steel industry to try and create jobs and create a world competitive industry. It is not coincidental that the people who are going to run trade policy for the United States under the Trump administration all come out of the steel industry. Robert Lighthizer, who's going to be his U.S. trade representative, is the go-to big-time steel lawyer in Washington, D.C. Wilbur Ross, the coming Commerce Secretary, was a vulture fund manager who bought out a whole bunch of steel companies in 2000 and then made a huge killing when the Bush administration put tariffs on imported steel, and he was able to sell those companies for 4 or 5 times what he bought them. The head of his transition team on trade, Dan D'Amico, is the former chief executive of Nucor, which is one of the biggest American steel producers. So these guys are all marinated in this history, effectively, of Chinese cheating and what it did to the United States. Peterson's position on currency was similar. You probably heard some about the debate over currency manipulation. Peterson wrote the memo right before Nixon pulled the United States off the gold standard, off of, he blew up the Bretton Woods system that had been created after the Second World War, and we moved to a system of floating exchange rates. Peterson said, look, the United States is going to need to pay attention to the value of the dollar to make sure that our manufacturing companies aren't priced out of international markets, and that other countries are not artificially holding down the value of their currency in a way that gives them unfair advantages over the United States. That affects both internal policy. We're going to have to look at things like our budget deficit. So if you run big budget deficits, that tends to drive up interest rates, tends to drive up the value of the dollar. But we'll also have to pay attention to try to keep other countries from cheating. Again, this was largely not done. I talk in particular about 2 episodes, the early 1980s, when the Japanese yen became tremendously undervalued compared to the dollar. That was mostly a US-owned goal having to do with Reagan administration policy. And then in the 2000s, when the Chinese were artificially holding down the value of their renminbi, clearly for competitive purposes, and the Bush administration, for a variety of reasons, did nothing about it. In the 2000s, if you look at manufacturing employment, again, you want to understand the roots of Donald Trump, despite all that foreign competition, manufacturing employment has stayed reasonably steady throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, about 17 million jobs. As a proportion of the economy, it was shrinking, but in absolute numbers, it stayed. 2000s, we lost 6 million manufacturing jobs in the United States, and we've gained very few of those back. A lot of that's a technology story, productivity story, but a not insignificant part of it was a Chinese competition story. So again, another enormous missed opportunity to deal with the problems that Pearson laid out in this memo. His recommendations went far beyond trade. He said, look, no matter what we do, there are going to be people who lose their jobs as a result of trade competition. So we need to put in place a very generous program of what's known as adjustment assistance to try to cushion those people, retrain them for new careers, help them move on with their lives. He wanted not just to help the workers, but actually the affected communities as well. The small towns with one factory, and the factory dries up and the town is in terrible shape. He wanted the labor unions to be on board in supporting this. This was one of John F. Kennedy's big initiatives. 1961, he launched the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. Again, it never came to fruition. First 8 years of the program, every single petition from a union or a company for trade adjustment assistance was turned down. The criteria were written so narrowly. Thousands and thousands of workers who lost their jobs to trade competition were told, no, you're not eligible. There's a case I write about in my book in Morristown, Tennessee, which is not that far south of here, a big Magnavox plant. It had about 600 workers that got driven out of business by Japanese competition. And the workers went to the government and said, look, we need trade adjustment assistance. And the commission that was hearing the case said, well, actually, the act says you have to be directly displaced by imports of a like product. And there's been a surge of Japanese finished televisions, but you're making components. Well, of course, the reason the Magnavox plant was closing was because the U.S. makers of finished televisions were no longer buying the components because they were getting driven out of business by the Japanese. But the workers were told, no, you're components makers, you're not television set makers, you don't qualify for trade adjustment assistance. And this has been the history throughout the program. And finally, Peterson argued, he said, look, the biggest challenges in adjusting to this more competitive global economy are going to be in domestic policy, making the investments in education, in research and development, in worker training, in infrastructure to help us get our product to markets, having sensible tax and regulatory policies so that the United States would be a good place to do business. I don't want to oversimplify the book by claiming that somehow as a country we failed across the board in these areas. I argue that our trade negotiating strategy, for all the anger that's been focused on trade agreements, has actually been pretty solid. U.S. government policy to encourage innovation has been very successful. The U.S. remains, by many measures, the most innovative economy in the world. But we do far too little as a country to try to attract foreign investment. Our corporate tax system desperately needs an overhaul. Last time we addressed the corporate tax was in 1986. We cut the top corporate tax rate to 35%, among the lowest of the wealthy countries in 1986. Since that time, in their own efforts to attract investment, every other country in the OECD has cut taxes, corporate taxes, to a lower rate than the United States. The U.S. now has the highest corporate tax rate of any wealthy country. And not surprisingly, that discourages companies from investing there. Our labor market policies, if you look at what's called, the OECD calls it active labor market trading, which is basically people lose jobs in one industry and you try to retrain them for work in another. We spend less as a share of our economy on active labor market programs than any OECD country except for Chile and Mexico. We spend about 0.1% of our GDP. In Denmark, I'm not saying Denmark should be our model, but in Denmark they spend 2% of GDP on active labor market programs. You lose your job in Denmark, and the government swoops in various ways to try to help and retrain you for another. Nothing similar exists here in the US. So as I write in the book, to caricature only slightly, the U.S. approach to the global economy for the last half century has been build it and we will succeed. In other words, if trade and investment rules are liberalized, then competition alone will lift up Americans. Few other countries behave that way. We are seeing now, I'm afraid, the chickens coming home to roost on our decades of failure as a country to take these challenges more seriously. On the trade issue, Donald Trump didn't just happen. He had been decades in the making. If you look, for instance, at big trade votes in Congress, so since the 1970s, trade agreements have had to be ratified by Congress. Increasingly, they encroach on areas of domestic policy that actually require changes to U.S. law, and so Congress has to vote on the trade agreements. Well, if you look, for instance, at the Tokyo Round Global Trade Agreement, it was one of these rounds of what used to be known as the GATT. So big global trade negotiation, went on for 5 years in the 1970s, involved pretty much every country in the world, cut tariffs by 30% across the board, put a whole bunch of other rules in place. President Carter took that to the Congress. The House voted 395 to 7 in favor of the Tokyo Round. You couldn't get that many votes for renaming a post office. Fast forward to the early 1990s and the vote over NAFTA. NAFTA was the first time, and it was controversial for this reason, the first time the United States entered into a trade agreement with a much poorer country, in a country where wage rates are far lower than the United States, and raised a whole set of fears about outsourcing, about companies chasing lower wages. The NAFTA debate was hugely controversial. It was fascinating as a reporter to cover it. At the end of the day, President Clinton couldn't even get a majority of his own Democratic Party in the House to support him. So it went through 234 to 200, but only because of Republican support. Clinton had started to lose the Democratic Party as far back as 1992, 1993 on this. By 2001, President